Hey everyone, welcome to the live stream. I'm looking forward to talking to you guys today. I have the chat open. Feel free to chime in if you have any questions. Let me know. I'm looking forward to answering any questions I can, joining in on the conversation. And I just have this slide deck that I'm going to go through that will show you the poster. We'll go ahead and kick it off. Yeah. So, just a quick intro about me. I'm not going to go on about myself too long. Easy to find me online, add me on LinkedIn, and you can get all this information. But just a little intro, my connection to SANS. I am the co-author of SANS 4509, Enterprise Cloud Forensics and Incident Response. I specifically specialize in Google Workspace and helped develop the extended content, and that's how I kind of got into this poster design that we're going to talk about here in a bit. I'm also the CFO of Mental Health Hackers, which is a nonprofit supporting mental health in the industry. You can check us out online. And my current job role, I'm working as a senior security engineer in IBM. So moving on to outside of about me, for what you guys came here for is the Enterprise Cloud Forensics and Incident Response poster overview. So the way this poster kind of emerged is we had talked about it as co-authors together about it would be great. If you haven't seen the other posters from SANS, you can find them all online, but the whole concept of these posters is kind of a high-level view of a specific topic. In this case, we're looking at cloud forensics and incident response, and a lot of this content aligns with the 4509 SANS class. At first, it was just part of it is to provide a high-level comparison between clouds. Things get complicated looking at AWS versus Azure versus Google Cloud Platform. But as I said, all the content is based on the work that's been done for SANS 4509. And so this poster is going to be additional support resource for the course for any students taking it. The labs, the capstone challenges, this poster is going to be super useful in helping you get a head start on those labs, have the quick, for example, you'll see command line references that may be useful. And then recently announced just a couple weeks ago, we're very proud that GIAC has developed a certification called the GIAC Cloud Forensics Responder Certification, the GCFR. That's being released later this year, just in time for this poster to be able to be released so that you can take it with you into your open book exam, and hopefully it'll provide you some assistance navigating that exam. So I thought the best way to approach this is I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to go through each section. I've kind of got a screenshot of the portion of the poster. Obviously, these posters are going to be big, 2-page, beautiful graphics, not easy to fit in a single PowerPoint slide. So I'm going to break down the poster for you. And obviously, with the release of the poster publicly, you'll get that beautiful single pane of glass picture. So starting off, the first concept is one of the first concepts that we teach in 4509, and it's differentiating this cloud terminology. If you're in tech or security, you know every vendor loves to have their unique trademarked fancy name for things. Unfortunately, when we start talking about concepts, it makes it hard to map to the different vendors. And so the first thing we do for you in the course and on this poster is provide you with this high level, what's the concept, what are the services offered by the key vendors that we cover in our course. And just to kind of specify, we go into AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud as our kind of cloud service platforms. And then for software as a service, you'll see Microsoft 365, Google Workspace. Obviously, we're aware that there is Oracle Cloud and Alibaba Cloud, but we try and focus on those that are going to be most broadly seen in the industry. So this very simple table to understand. On the left-hand side, we have different services that can be provided. These cloud services will give you virtual machines, serverless functions you can run, VM disk storage, object storage versus network file storage, You can perform virtual networking. Obviously, we'll go into this later in the poster, but there's logging. And then message queuing. So these are kind of the biggest, most common services. Obviously, if you've ever looked at like the AWS Azure service list, you know that there's about 60,000 different services you can acquire and implement. But these are the ones that you're going to see most commonly and the associated service. So super easy table to understand. But if it's very, very helpful to have that reference. I know I'll be in courses and I'll stumble over, VNet. Wait, no, I mean VPC. Wait, are we talking about Google Cloud? Okay, doesn't matter. Then it's a cloud virtual network. So having a single view, one little block that differentiates these is an important part of the poster, and that's why I decided to make it this first section. Then we start getting into more of what is useful for the course from the aspect that our course is on forensics and incident response, but our course focuses due to the logistics of interacting with multiple clouds. We provide you with a lot of the logs and you learn how to work an incident by analyzing those logs for significant activity. So first on the poster, after getting that terminology out of the way, we dive into what log sources you should be looking at as an analyst. In the Microsoft world, we have 365 and Azure. 365 is super easy. They have the unified audit log. It's a single log. It contains everything from every Microsoft workload, which is like the different services and applications, and then all user and admin activity. And it's able to be accessed through a few different methods. You can either use what's now called the Purview Compliance Portal. You can use PowerShell to connect, or you can use the API. And we'll go into gathering these logs a little bit later on the poster in that subsection. Then you have Azure. So in Azure, there are a bunch of different log types, and they're stored differently. You have your tenant logs and your subscription logs. Those are both on by default. And you can see on the right kind of what that includes. That includes audit logs, sign-in logs, identity, and different other sign-in activities, and then activity logs for the different applications. There's also logs that are off by default, but could be enabled. Resource logs, for example, this includes NSG flow logs if you want to get flow data. There's operating system logs, which is exactly what you think. So obviously, if you're running a Windows VM, within that VM, you're going to have its own logs. And those are the operating system logs, the things you'd see in like Windows Event Viewer. And luckily for us, you can capture those logs and they're stored in what you can see on the right is the WAD Windows Event Log table, or for Linux, the Linux syslog files. And then lastly, we have application logs. Again, similar to operating system logs, you'll have services and VMs you work with where they have their own native logs. So it's not for your cloud account as a whole, but working on those specific resources, systems, and applications. For these logs in Azure versus 365, you are able to view them directly on the Azure portal, just like you can view the unified audit log in its portal. You can store them in a log analytics workspace, which we dive into more in the course, but this is just eventually a Microsoft provided log analysis tool. You can send them to a storage account for either archival and export if you just want those raw logs, no sort of analysis or shipping to a SIM. And then that last point, what a lot of you will probably do in an enterprise environment is you're going to use either Event Hub or the Graph API, and you're going to send them to a SIM. So all of these different methods of shipping the logs, we don't dive in on the poster. Obviously, this poster is supposed to be a high level, give you the information you need. If you want to dive into actually configuring those sources, both our course 4509 will provide you some of that information on getting access to those logs, and then potentially some of the other cloud courses will give you some information there. This section then continues with the rest of our cloud and software as a service platforms. We've got AWS. Here we've got a ton of log types. Like I said, when I log into AWS, I see the list of services I can access, and it's insane how many services there are. But that's why I called this section not just log sources, but significant log sources. We're only scraping the surface on what you could look into. But as an analyst, where am I going to go first? And for AWS, that's CrowdTrail, which is the audit logs. That's going to be the bulk of your logs. But we also have CrowdTrail Insights. It's kind of an additional service that Amazon provides where it will look for API usage outside of the baselines and kind of alert you to that specific activity. You also have CloudWatch logs. Those are logs that come from applications and endpoints, kind of like when I was talking about Microsoft, how you can get those operating system and application logs. GuardDuty is a built-in Amazon security service, so we have logs from that. That's for any anomaly detections that Amazon is providing. VPC flow logs, again, getting those net flow logs from your network deployments, and they're in the format of a flow log. S3 server access are logs from any of your storage buckets, your S3 storage buckets. Route 53 is a service provided by Amazon for DNS, and so it provides DNS resolver logs. And then lastly, if you're deploying a load balancer in AWS, there could be some interesting things happening in those logs. And these are all logs that we individually break down in 40509 and tell you what kind of activity you can find from within the logs. So if you want to know more about the why is this specific log important, go take our course. You'll learn all about it. Each log type has its own little section. For accessing these logs, once again, console access, the usual login, go and download. With S3 setup, you can actually store logs in an S3 bucket and connect it with Athena, which becomes like a search tool, almost acting like a database for you to search through if you need some keyword searching. AWS has yet another security tool called AWS Detective, which allows for some log analysis functionality. Both Athena and Detective are touched on in 4509. And then lastly, again, if you're using a SIM, if you're using all these different services, which a lot of you probably are if you know about SIMs and that, you can ship them to your SIM, and you do this with Event Hub. Moving on to the Google world of Google. GCP, once again, there is a lot more logs you can get, but we're going to highlight the logs where you're going to find the information that's most useful to your investigations. Obviously, admin activity, system event logs, group audit logs, login audit logs. Those are the kind of logs you're used to seeing, different audit logs, seeing when people are signing in, taking actions, making admin changes. We also have access transparency logs. So what that is if Google responds, for example, to a request for information from the government, it will pop up in that log, basically a log of like, hey, that we accessed your GCP environment. And then Josh Lemon, who wrote the GCP section from our course, he wanted me to highlight that unlike a lot of the cloud service providers, which are going to offer you 30, 60, 90 days of free log storage, Google has been very generous. Is the default bucket stores 400 days of free logs. So that is always very much appreciated when you don't get nickeled and dimed for every little piece of storage. And then Google Workspace, those, you have the admin logs, drive logs, Gmail logs, OAuth logs, rules logs, takeout logs, user logs. So all of these, again, this is not the breadth of what you can get from Google Workspace. You can go and you can get logs for services like Meet or Chat. What are users doing with their Chrome browsers, their Android devices? It goes so in depth, but I really wanted to break out the logs that are going to be your go-tos. Drive is very important. If you're using your Google Workspace to store sensitive files, Drive logs showing access are important. Emails, obviously, a lot of attacks use email as an initial infection vector, so you want to see what's happening. OAuth and admin logs, user logs, all of those are going to tell you about sign-ins and changes made to the system, API calls made, and then rules and takeout, again, important logs from a security perspective. And if you want to look at my last webcast, I believe it's up on YouTube. I'm sure Viv will drop a link with me mentioning that. My last webcast was all about Google Workspace defer, diving into looking at some of those logs and what activities are in there. So go check out that talk, or again, the course if you want to get a real deep dive into the nitty gritty of the logs. So like I said, not only is this poster just a general knowledge of cloud defer, it also acts as a supplemental tool for our 4509 students. So in the course, we do use SoftElk as our log analysis tool. And so in order to do that, we provide you with the logs exported from our cloud platforms so that you do not have to generate a bunch of logs or try and figure out how to access these different services. We give you the logs, but you have to get them into SoftElk. And with the labs, we'll handhold a little bit, tell you how. But our new amazing multi-cloud intrusion challenge on day 6, you're kind of left to your own. So I wanted to give a little bit of guidance on getting these logs into SoftElk. And it's easy enough. It's as easy as moving the logs to its associated log folder. So for each log type, I've provided the log folder. That's essentially where you'd place it. I've told you what kinds of logs you can place in those folders, and then where the parser config is. So if you're super into open source and like looking at the code, I love going in and looking at the code for the different open source tools we use. So SoftElk is completely open source, so you can either go on your SoftElk system or to the GitHub repo and go to that parser and actually see how it's taking those logs and injecting it into Elk. So for Microsoft 365, you're going to grab the unified audit log. You have to have it in CSV format for the parsing to work. And you can grab that either from the portal or via PowerShell. Azure, however, is not CSV formatted. And this is the section where you come in and you start seeing how cloud gets complex. So we were just talking about Microsoft. We're still talking about Microsoft, but now instead of talking about CSV formatted logs exported from the portal or PowerShell, we need to export the logs in JSON format from your storage account, and you need to grab 3 separate logs, the tenant, the subscription, and the resource logs. Not only this, but unfortunately, when you export the logs, you're going to get, in some cases, these PT1H files. And basically, a file is created at an hourly interval that contains the events from that time frame. But it's all exported into, you have all these files in a subfolder. And so this pre-processing command I provide, it basically looks for all those JSON files, puts them together in a single JSON file that can then be ingested via the Logstash folder. So that's the kind of thing that is kind of hard to remember. And a lot of students will be like, what do I do with 100 of these individual same name JSON files versus the unified audit log that you just drop in the folder. So is it very important to me to get all this on here so that when you're in your labs, when you're in your GCFR exam, when you're in the capstone intrusion challenge, you've got all these PTH1 files, boom, poster tells you, run this find command, it'll put them in an output folder, and then here's your Logstash folder they go into. So this is probably one of the most useful parts of the poster in terms of if you're going to be doing the capstone challenge, keep these on hand. Say for AWS, in this case, it's CrowdTrail logs that we are parsing. And unfortunately, they are in a format that is not immediately parsed just by placing in the folder. So once again, I provide you with the pre-processing commands. There's a script. I believe it's on our GitHub repo, but it's definitely on the VM you receive as a student. And it will take the log and convert it into a format that Logstash will understand and put it in its associated folder. And then after that, we've got GCP, GWS, so the Google logs, and then also flow logs. So for Google, you're gonna get the logging exports from one of those methods we talked about, whether it's the console, the API, something like that, and drop those straight in the GCP folder, easy peasy. Again, I provide the path to the parser if you want to look at the code, see how it's processing those. I believe those are in JSON format. I did not put it on the poster. I guess that's something I could add. Google Workspace, there's two different types of logs you may need. For audit logs, like those Google Drive logs, for example, you can export those via the API in a JSON format. I found that's the cleanest method. I do on our course GitHub have a script that will pull down various audit log types from Google Workspace, and it will be in the resources section of this poster. So you can grab that, run it, and get the audit logs in a JSON format. However, email tracking logs, due to the fact that at this time I cannot find a way getting all the information needed with the API, instead I put those email tracking logs, you have to download them from the portal via download button. It will export it to a Google Sheet, I believe, which then of course can be downloaded as CSV and go into that Logstash folder. And then lastly, we have flow logs. So flow logs can come from both Google, AWS, and Azure. All have flow logs, either via NSG or VPC applications. They have to be enabled. They're off by default. Obviously, NetFlow, it stores a lot of data, so you have to configure that. But if it's configured, once again, we have two scripts that we've developed in order to work with these flow logs and turn them into the text files, the log files that are needed for Logstash. So the two commands are here. There's a separate command for AWS versus versus Azure. They both spit out the flow logs in that format, and then you're going to throw them in the NetFlow Logstash folder to get them into your NetFlow, and that will put it in a different index. So if you don't know a lot about SoftElk, words like parsers and Logstash and indexes may not necessarily make sense, but if you take the course, you'll see how this poster provides you with what you need to get those logs ready for review, instead of flipping through all your textbooks and Googling, trying to figure out what folder goes where, wasting time on that instead of doing the real analysis. One of the other things that varies a lot across vendors, and I put this in here, it's a question that I have no inside knowledge of this, but if I were to guess what kind of questions you might see on the exam, I wouldn't put it past them mentioning default log retention. So again, that is not me giving you secret knowledge. I would just assume that it would be good to know this going into an exam. So as we talked about, AWS, Azure, and GCP all have different services that they use for storage. For example, buckets for Google, S3 for AWS, etc. But they typically all pipe their logs to a similar separate log source. And so you can see here that the retention for logs is very, very different depending on which vendor you're going with. For AWS, for those that are on by default, they retain for 30 days by default. For Azure, you're going to get 90 days of default retention. And as we talked about with GCP, they're very generous over a year of data. For anyone working here as a responder, you know that 30 days of log data is not always great. Unfortunately, the nature of our work, sometimes we find intrusions 3 to 6 months after it's happened, and we don't have those logs. And that's why we recommend in the course, I have my keynote with Josh Lemon coming up at the D4 Summit, where we're going to talk a lot about this, is keep in mind that the retention provided by default is not enough a lot of the times. So you should be backing up to a separate storage bucket. You should be shipping it to a SIM if you've got one, or some storage server. So for keeping that in mind, that's definitely something to look into. but it's good to know by default what you're going to have. For example, if you're, I've historically worked for an MSSP, they bring us in on an incident, or if you're an incident response consultant, they bring us in and say, here's the logs we have. You can't prevent the fact that they didn't think ahead and back up their logs to a SIM. So at times, you may be in a situation where you have 30 days and that's all you have. No one backed up logs, unfortunately. So it's good to know how much data you're going to be looking at based on the environment that that organization is within. This is probably one of the funnest sections of the poster, in my opinion. Funnest is not a word. I apologize. But this is kind of the poster. I actually have to give credit to David Cohen for this section of the poster. He really put together a lot of this content. So here we kind of thought about some of the common scenarios that you're going to see in cloud incident response, and we go into all types of we go into like these different scenarios that can happen in the course and how they happen. But what we wanted to do with this section was, if you're investigating this type of incident, where should you be looking? Now, as you can see on AWS, pretty much everything you're going to want or need is going to be in the CloudTrail logs. Is very much a unified log. Same for Microsoft 365 on the far right. No matter what, is all going to be piped into the UAL. Those two are easy. AWS, Microsoft 365, you've got an overarching log. Unfortunately, when it comes to Azure, GCP, GWS, they break up their logs a lot more into different categories. It's useful for when you're trying to look for a specific thing, not useful if you're just trying to work an incident as a whole and now have to look across dozens of different log sources. So here we talk about what's the scenario, where's evidence that could be. Things like impossible travel. And what we mean by that is, I'm logged in from Texas right now. If you saw me log into one of my accounts in China in 3 minutes, it's probably not me. Obviously, with the case, it could be a VPN, but in general, that's something to kind of look into. And obviously, on the middle sections, the ones with the unique logs, you can see all of them come from these sign-in login logs or audit user logs, places that are going to show who's signing in with an IP address you can geolocate, etc. Console access, there's kind of, it's not really relevant for Google Workspace, but in Azure and GCP, there is logs to document access to the console via the API or the UI, whatever. We talk about exposed keys and secrets a lot in cloud. Obviously, in order to interact with the cloud, some exchange of credentials has to be occurring, and there's also a lot of API interactions. So on GitHub, there's developers who don't know secure coding and might just throw different keys in there. And so it's important to look at kind of the authentication and system events related to keys and system secrets. Storage is pretty obvious one. If you're looking at storage canaries, files that shouldn't be touched, each of the services has no bucket for storage activity. Lateral movement, that's again going to be kind of more on the generic, what are users doing? Same with password sprays, you're going to look at access to the systems. So that one becomes similar to impossible travel. We're really honing in on that initial access. How did they log into the account? And then lastly, we talk about cloud tenant enumeration. For those of you who are familiar with kill chains in cybersecurity, once you get into that, once you get into an environment, you want to spread laterally as an attacker. And to do that, you need to know where you can go. In the cloud, there's a bunch of services that may be able to be pivoted to. It's not just a workstation to workstation type of thing. You're going to have services that could be abused. So there's different activity logs, system event logs, and service logs across the different vendors that will kind of give some insight into this activity of people trying to find out what else there is. There's a second section in the threat hunting in the cloud section that's very specific, and it's risky AWS API calls. And what I mean by risky in this case is every single one of these API calls has the potential to expose a password. So whether that's through STS, which is the secure token service that kind of brokers a lot of the authentication, or IAM if you're using IAM. It could be service specific, so like Redshift or the RDS database, those are application specific, but there's API calls that are made that involve credentials being passed. So all of these, the use of having them here is once I've pumped my logs into a SIM or a log analysis tool, this value is going to be in a field of this is the API call that was made. So if you're looking to see if any sensitive data was exposed or any abnormal, reconnaissance activity for credentials is happening, you can literally just search for these strings. Hey, is this present? Has anyone called these endpoints? If they did call the endpoint, who is it? Is it someone who should be calling that endpoint, or do we need to look into this further? So this was part of the course, and I kind of just, again, I stole it from Dave. He's very nice to share his material. We go into it in the course as a topic of like these API interactions that can expose data. And so I wanted to have a quick list of if someone's investigating to see if any risky API calls were made, they can just take this list and search for that activity. The second to last section goes into CLI. So a lot of the cheat sheets from SANS, they give you a little CLI section to be made. They give you a little CLI section to interact with the different services or tools or anything like that may be useful. So there's kind of three different parts in the CLI section. The first is connections to the Microsoft clouds using PowerShell. So obviously we have 365 and Azure from Microsoft. Both of them have PowerShell modules provided by Microsoft. Couple 3 quick commands and you can have your account connected very easily. But again, sometimes you just need this quick reference. It's not hard, but instead of searching through all your textbooks or Google for what you need, here you go. Here's your 3 command lines. Let's get connected. Also talk about, so that was Microsoft. That was actually connecting to the instance. From that point, you can interact with it, do things like that. And the second part is log collection from AWS and Google. So CloudTrail logs, you've seen, those are the ones that are going to contain the most information for us. There's a very easy AWS CLI from their default tool. You point to an S3 bucket containing your logs and you download them all. Easy peasy. The AWS CLI provides a lot of like default built-in commands to do different things like that. Same with Google Cloud. Google Cloud, the logs are stored in buckets. So you can list out that bucket. And when you find the buckets you want, you can pull logs from them. You can do searches like the example provided where I'm reading the logs for anything that has a timestamp between the time frame I'm interested in. And like I said, we want them in JSON so that we can ingest them into SoftVault or some other SIM that takes structured data. And so I pipe them out to a JSON file. And that's how you get logs from those services. And then the last CLI activity is related to snapshots. If you're not familiar with snapshots, then you need to take some SANS courses, especially the cloud courses, and especially 509. So a snapshot is like, if you're familiar with the traditional on-premise style of forensics, you take a disk image so that you can basically interact with the victim host without affecting the host. Well, lucky for us, while we can image virtual machines that are running in the cloud using traditional imaging methods, what is easier for us is a capability called snapshotting. And it is essentially taking an image. You can see in the first one, Azure Snapshot Download, we're using a tool called AZ Copy that allows us to grab a snapshot URL, which is provided by Azure as you take a snapshot, and output it to a virtual hard drive file on the system. And that virtual hard drive file could then be mounted or analyzed by some tool that supports virtual hard drives. Same thing for AWS. except in this case, you need the snapshot ID. Again, can be found in the portal after you take a snapshot. And then we use a tool called Cold Snap to perform that download, in this case, outputting it to a DD file, which again, if you're used to taking images for forensics investigations or IR, you are going to be able to use that file with your various forensics tools or mount it. An alternative to the Cold Snap tool, as you see, the Cold Snap's a one-liner to get that DD image. What you can do is, using a series of commands, is snapshot, then mount the snapshot. And mounting the snapshot is basically very similar to where we're now going to create a new virtual machine. It's almost like copying and pasting that host that you snapshotted. So the first command simply creates that snapshot with a volume ID you provide. You then take the snapshot you created along with your system you want to mount the image to. So it may be your DFIR AMI that has all your analysis tools on it. And you're going to mount or create a volume on that VM using your snapshot. And then you can attach the volume ID that you created. Basically, what all this does eventually is you now have your DFIR investigation virtual machine running in the cloud, and you can use that to analyze the snapshot you created because it's all mounted. If you've taken 4508 from SANS, you've done this whole process of taking an image, mounting it to your SIFT workstation, then running tools against the mounted hard drive. This is the exact same thing, but all happening in AWS via snapshots. So once again, this talk is not to dive into snapshots or imaging or all of that. So if that all sounds interesting to you and you want to investigate more, the courses at SANS will teach you that whole process. And then lastly, the basic section, resources. So first resource is probably the most significant. It's our public GitHub. In there, I have my tool I wrote for Google Workspace log collection. There's also converter tools. We have snippets of useful commands, etc. And so the rest of the links are tools from third parties. So CrowdStrike, Tesorian, Invictus, all of them. They've made different tools to download logs, collect logs. And so we want to provide references to those for those trying to export logs for analysis. So how do you get a copy? If you came here, you're probably interested in getting a copy eventually. And there's a couple ways. First, there's physical copies. If you've ever been to a conference, one of the SANS conferences, summits, trainings, a lot of times they'll have the posters out. And in this case, we wanted to do, I had the timing all lined up, is one of our first big public runs of 4509 as a 6-day is at the DFIR Summit. And I managed to time this release that if you are at the DFIR Summit in Austin on August 15th or 16th, you will get your hands on the first ever copies of the Enterprise Cloud Forensics and Incident Response poster. If you're not going to be at the summit, hopefully you'll see the poster at future events, but also it's going to be online, completely free, on sans.org as of 8/18. I believe Viv has a link that she'll drop for us that points to the webpage where you'll be able to find it. Right now, it's just a splash page. Like I said, I had a lot of fun developing this, and I really wanted to do something special for the release. So we decided on this limited initial release in person at the DFIR Summit, and then we'll go online public afterwards. So you all will get access to that very soon in the coming weeks. With that, I think that's everything for me. I saw a lot of chat. I'm amazed. I see people tune in from Croatia and Africa and Europe and Canada and all over the US, Zambia. It's so great to get all this support. I really appreciate it. I know time zones can get crazy for these kinds of things. And so yeah, it's great. I love seeing you all. I'm happy to take questions, comments, concerns. I know that a WG did chime in. He said, unless there's a distinction being made after the logs are manually configured for storage in the required bucket, in which case this is not default behavior. So I'm guessing that was in response to the default log retention of 400 days. And that is correct. There is some configuration settings that need to be made related to the various buckets. And that was not something that I felt needed to be dived into on the poster. Unfortunately, the challenge of creating a poster is trying to convey everything you want to convey on 2 pages. So what I did do was I tried to provide that high level, like this is likely what you're going to see. But of course, there are tons of caveats of what settings you make, what buckets things are going into. So yeah, I think it's definitely a lot of asterisks on things like the log retention, as there's a lot of factors that can be involved. Another question popping up, a couple questions. Someone asked about log verbosity settings. So each of the platforms, kind of like my last comment, each of the platforms is totally different in how they handle what's logged and all of that. But there is for sure tons of like additional things that can be logged that are not enabled by default. I really, really recommend the DFIR Summit is going to be free online if you can't make it to Austin in person. And my keynote talk with Josh Lemon is all about making sure that your logging is set up to be robust and to prepare you for an incident so that you're not coming in and going, wait, AWS only stored the last 30 days and this guy broke in 45 days ago. We can't do anything. So we're going to give you a talk about the different logging settings. It's all very confusing depending on who you have. So I will say, to answer that question on both the more of the in-depth view of logging settings, check out our talk there. And then another user asked, what skills do you think a security engineer should learn? So yeah, like I said, I'm a security engineer. I really focus on detection engineering and log analysis. So I think in terms of the skills that would be good to learn, it's really you got to start with the basics, especially security engineering is such a wide topic. So get your basics down. I always suggest studying for the CompTIA Security Plus, even though it's not. Even if you don't necessarily want to get the certification, you don't feel the need for the certification, the content itself provides a good overview. And then you can dive into areas that you see specialties, blog posts, Twitter, YouTube, free conferences online. Since, if we're going to talk about any good things that may have come out of COVID, is all these conferences such as SANS, thinking, how do we make this available to those who can't come in person? So you got the DFIR Summit. Go listen to as many talks as you're free for. Soak up knowledge. That's all I can recommend. So I was then asked, is there anything related to AKS, EKS, JKE related incident response and forensics? I'm not sure I understand the acronyms you're asking, Judith or Udith. Can you post and expand your acronyms so I can make sure I'm talking on the right topic? And Vivek asks, how are we collecting database logs from the logs? So from the cloud. So database logs, if you're talking about a database service, that kind of goes back. Let me see if I can bring up this slide from a while back. Let's see. So for example, again, it's going to vary by platform, but I'm going to take the example of Azure. Obviously, if you're using like a database service, a lot of the cloud providers will basically stage a cloud database that you can store stuff in. Azure, for example, you'd want to pull those application or operating system logs. So you're not pulling the cloud logs specifically because you're not talking, if you're talking about like what's occurring in the database, it's not the high level cloud logs. That's going to tell you, hey, someone accessed this database service. If you want to look at the actual database, then you need to look at the logs at a local perspective, those application logs. So there may be some tools to more easily pull them out from the console, but in general, it's now the local logs hosted on a cloud service. Okay, Udith did a comment. I was thinking you were talking about Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is not mentioned on this poster at this time, but for 509, part of the expansion that was added to the course, the day 5, now includes a section on Kubernetes. It doesn't go, is only like half a day or something like that. Unfortunately, we can't go so into depth on containers in a cloud class, but as you brought up the question, it is very relevant. There is a lot of Kubernetes and container stuff running in the cloud. So we do touch on that in the course in terms of where logs are, how we interact. So more details specifically on containers in the cloud. Let's see, did I get them all? I think I got all the current questions. If anyone else has anything, we'll stick around for a few minutes, and if not, then we'll close out, but I'll give everyone a couple more seconds to type. Thank you for everyone saying thank you. You're welcome, and thank you for joining. So these streams only happen if we have people show up. No one wants to run an hour-long stream for an empty audience. So it's all you guys that show up and attend these presentations that really make it worth doing it. So I would not want to talk to an empty room, but apparently I'm talking to half the world based on where some of you are talking from. So happy to do it. I failed to put up my contact information on this screen. I usually provide it. If you need to reach out to me, there you go. Someone threw it on the stream for me. So LinkedIn, Twitter. I'm not going to lie, my LinkedIn response time is much slower than Twitter, so I'd recommend going through Twitter if you can, but I'll get with you eventually on LinkedIn, and I will provide you my email happily if we need to have a longer conversation on anything. I'm always happy to help out. It looks like Braxton is asking best site or info for studying for the CompT exam I mentioned, for someone asking about skills. For that, I would say it really depends on your learning type. I typically learn from paper books, so I'll order study guides on Amazon. But YouTube, the good thing about the CompT and the reason I mentioned that one is because it's so widespread that there's free training all over the place. You can go to Udemy for some cheap paid courses, YouTube for free content, Cybrary. So all you have to do is like Google it and you'll find plenty of study material. Awesome. And somebody asked if the presentation will be shared. I believe it is going to be on YouTube, the recording in future. So maybe Viv can chime in on the exact answer. But in short, yes, you will be able to rewatch this presentation. Okay, everyone have an amazing weekend, an amazing August. Hopefully I'll see some of you at DEF CON or the DFIR Summit. I'll be at Blue Team Con in Chicago. So if you see me, feel free to say hi. I'm always loving to meet new people in person, especially you took your time to come here. So I'm ready to talk to you all in person too. Manish asked, for a multi-cloud environment, do I have resources for standard practice or procedure for forensics? Ooh, that's a great question. Yeah, multi-cloud, from my point of view, you're still, even if you have multi-cloud, you're still responding in the same way to a single cloud. You just have more log sources. So you're not going to be able to just log into AWS and stay in their portal. The main thing is you really do need to have that normalized like SIM or log analysis tool. Other than that, the standard practices and procedures are going to be very similar. It's just going to be, you're going to need to do it across your environment. So snapshots, you're going to have to figure out, okay, which machines do I need to snapshot? which cloud are they in, how do I do it for that cloud. So multi-cloud is, in my opinion, is going to be very, very similar procedures, just taking into account you have more data sources. Same concept of working an incident in a traditional on-prem enterprise. You need to think about what servers are, what are all the servers I need to get logs for. You may be a mixed Windows and Linux shop, but you still follow incident response the same. You just do Windows forensics and Linux forensics, and then connect your findings into a single finding. Cool.